Good morning, X Winterview, with another brief dialogue for his dear friend, Annastacey. Today's dialogue, something a little bit different, something a little bit more mental health. This one is on anxiety, or nervousness, if you prefer. This is one perspective on anxiety, not the only perspective. Just putting that out there as a caveat. The other caveat is that I'm in my car. I'm driving defensively, of course, as is my way. So there might be some unusual pausing as I stop to dodge pedestrians or run them down, depending on my mood. Anxiety is a very prevalent concern in mental health. You might say it's the bread and butter of mental health. We see it every day and deal with it every day. To the general public who don't suffer clinical levels of anxiety, it's very hard to imagine why anxiety can be so troublesome. So maybe we'll cover that in brief. Anxiety in the clinical setting, as I said, is extremely common because it drives avoidant behavior. Why? Well, no one likes to feel anxious, in a nutshell. The range of avoidant behaviors is as wide and as varied as there are grains of sand on the beaches of the world. If something triggers anxiety, you can be sure you will find avoidance of the stimulus that creates or is believed to create the anxiety. This can become a clinical problem when it becomes so overwhelming that the individual does not want to eat, bathe, leave the house, seek work, turn up at their work, talk to their partner, talk to their kids, engage in healthy and functional behaviors that most people take for granted in general. Anxiety becomes so bad that that person cannot do them. And then there's the other part of anxiety, which is the literal discomfort, the somatic, visceral, felt sense of nervousness in the body. Sometimes it gets so bad that the person with anxiety feels they can't cope, or sometimes they have panic attacks, which feels like you're about to die. Sometimes the anxiety is so chronic and so awful and so all-pervasive that that person becomes suicidal. Sometimes anxiety can drive depression and other mental health problems. Often it goes hand in hand with a wide range of, as we say in psychology, comorbid issues, as in other stuff going on. All in all, it's very unpleasant if it's a chronic and clinical issue. However, most people, in fact, I could even wager everyone, would have some degree of anxiety about something. Of course, it's not cool to go around admitting that you're afraid of stuff, but it's that unease, that I don't know if I can sensation that sometimes pops up when you have to do something, and the mind will report, I don't like this, or I don't want to do it, or I'd rather do something else, or can't we just do such and such, or let's just take a shortcut because of the anxiety. And so even in your professional day-to-day life, even though you might not be afflicted with clinical levels of anxiety, you might find subtle avoidances, even at work or with your family, because of anxiety. Even the anxiety of being found out that you're not as competent as you've led everyone to believe can be a powerful motivator at work to avoid stuff, we'll say. Anxiety is that feeling of fear gone crazy, that feeling of what should be a little brief spurt of fear about something that is reasonably dangerous, we might say, pervades or invades our life in such a way that everything seems dangerous. And that comes back to that earlier point of avoidance. So it's natural to avoid anxiety, or natural to avoid the thing that we think will cause us anxiety. So let's explore. What is it that we think is going to happen? Well, on the most fundamental level, anxiety is a fear of death, or a fear of annihilation, a fear of loss in the future. So for a lot of anxiety concerns, there's a lot of future conceptualizing going on. What's going to happen down the road, from a minute from now, an hour from now, a day from now, a week, a year, etc. Some sort of frame of future thinking, you might say. So anxiety requires some kind of temporal awareness, and more than that, a perception that something important will be lost, or something important will happen in the future. So there's a heavily laden sense of value that comes with anxiety. You have to value something to fear its loss. Otherwise, you wouldn't care. That's why we feel anxious about losing money, losing time, losing our minds, losing our partners, losing stuff that we value. So the mind, in its role here, needs to have a future conceptualization, a fear of catastrophic consequence, and a conceptualization of value. These all contribute to the feeling of anxiety. Let's take a very typical example that we might see in the clinic. And this is a fear of what we call in psychology self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is a fancy pants way of saying the ability to do something that you need to do to survive, like a day-to-day activity. And self-efficacy is your belief, so to speak, in your ability, your personal ability to accomplish that goal. So let's make an example. I need to go to the supermarket and buy some groceries for the week. Now, if I have no issues around self-efficacy and the supermarket, I will literally just walk in, grab my stuff, pay, and go without nary a raise of heartbeat or stress. But what if you believe that you might fail at this task, or you don't really know how to do it, such that you start to feel nervous when you think about it? What if I get lost in the supermarket? What if I buy the wrong things? What if the person at the checkout wants to have a little conversation with me and I feel a bit socially anxious? I don't want to talk, etc. You can see that as the feelings or the belief in your ability to achieve the task go down, your feelings of anxiety will naturally increase. So self-efficacy is a biggie in psychology. We see that all the time. Now I've chosen a very simple example of the supermarket, but actually it can be very, very straightforward. It could be, what is my self-efficacy of getting out the door today? I don't even think I can do that. I don't even think I can feed myself or clothe myself or dress myself. It can get that bad. For a lot of people, it's around novel situations, the worry that you won't know what to do in a new situation. When we explore self-efficacy, we often find, or very frequently find, a sense of, very close to a sense of shame, and shame being that awful feeling that there's something wrong with you. So, the deeper level of fear, you might say, of anxiety is, if I fail at this task, it's that I'll be getting negative judgments from people around me and I'll feel bad about it, is often the deeper culprit. Because let's face it, if there was no one there to observe or judge you doing that task, you probably wouldn't care. And that goes for any task. So let's say the supermarket, if you had a poor feeling of self-efficacy about achieving your goals in the supermarket and had been avoiding it, then if you were to say, look, it's a supermarket where there's actually no employees, there's no other customers, you can go to it whenever you feel like, day or night, and no one's going to even know you've been there, then suddenly the issue of self-efficacy goes out the window. You might think, well, I'll totally fail and suck at that task, but at least no one will be there to know that. So there's a feeling of, there's another element to anxiety, is the conceptualization of the opinion of others. Now, not just any old opinion, your opinion, the opinion of others on your worth as a person. So that's a big one. That ties into value. You value your own self-worth, therefore you value the opinions of others. Of course, it's a whole mental construct at the end of the day. You've got to imagine the opinions of others. So often in the clinic when we talk to people about anxiety, they're frequently imagining what others are thinking about them as part of the anxiety disorder. And part of the treatment is often to just talk with them about it in a realistic way, to get them to understand that, you know what, most people aren't thinking about you, and if they are, they probably don't care that much, at least as much as you think they do. So, there we have a few of the major concepts in the mind about anxiety and why the mind will conspire against you to create overwhelming and awful feelings of anxiety all the time. The other thing too is, and this is getting a little bit more deep here and a bit more maybe esoteric, is that the mind commonly believes that what it thinks about has some basis in reality. Now this is just a natural structure of the mind. This is just something the mind does. It presumes that there's some out there external arbitration or thing that it aspires to emulate. I didn't explain that very well. Let's imagine that, here's a good one, the mind thinks that there is a God, and the God has a very strict idea of how you need to be a good human. And so if you don't do what this imagined God says that you should do as a human, you're a bad human. So some sense of some benchmark to judge your behavior by. Now, the reason I say imagined is because there is actually no arbiter of good and bad human behavior other outside of cultural norms or family norms or ideas that you might have. So the mind needs to create or have an idea about some reference point to which to judge its actions on. And there's another element of anxiety, another concept around it, some benchmarking, you might say. So the anxious person somehow is very aware of what constitutes poor behavior. And again, in clinic, we need to explore that with the person and figure out, well, where are you getting this reference point from? It seems to the person with anxiety often that everyone else knows exactly what to do and they're doing it. And if I have a go, because I don't know what to do, I'll fail at the task and everyone will laugh at me and they'll make fun of me and tease me and call me names, and therefore I will avoid it. And you see this so frequently in the clinic, and in some cases it's a very sweet, endearing quality in the person that they had naively thought this was to be the case, and after a very brief chat they realize it isn't, and the anxiety clears up. Now, it's not true for everyone. For some it's a little bit more pernicious and a bit more ingrained, you might say. But it all gets messy and mixes in together. But you can see that anxiety, at least in the way I've been talking about it, relies very heavily on mental constructs in order to create the anxiety. But there are times when we all know that anxiety is probably quite useful, and those would be actual, real situations of danger. So, be a bit cautious if it's dangerous would be a good idea. Let's say you're in a rural area and there's a paddock and you need to cross the paddock, but you notice that there's a bull in the paddock. Now, you could walk all the way around this paddock, but it's a huge paddock and you've got to walk maybe a mile or, all the way around. You think, I could just walk across and save a lot of time. But that bull, I don't know, he might not like that. So anyway, you start to feel a bit nervous. So you get into the paddock, and that nervousness What does it do? It focuses your attention on the perceived source of threat, the bull in this case. And you're watching the bull very carefully, and the bull is just eating grass and kind of watching you and just kind of ignoring you, so you get closer and closer, and then suddenly the bull just stops eating the grass, and it decides in its bull mind, you think, uh-oh, I don't think the bull likes me being in here. And the bull starts stamping its foot and snorting and making bucking gestures with its head, and you think, okay, I got to get out of here. And the anxiety that kept you focused on the bull is now very useful. The body surges with adrenaline. You turn, you run, look behind you, and yep, that bull is chasing you. So you sprint for your life, panicking, mind filling you with fantasies of getting crushed and gored by the bull. Oh my god, it's terrible, it's awful. And eventually you make it, and the story ends happily. However, that was a good thing you were anxious. If you weren't anxious and you just blindly strolled across that paddock, you might not be around to tell that tale, and nor were your ancestors to listen to that tale. So there's an evolutionary, adaptive, you might say, reason to be a bit anxious sometimes, and I think we can all agree without going into any more examples. So when it becomes maladaptive, it's basically what we're saying is kind of exaggerated, crazy anxiety, where there's no real danger. You don't have to be anxious about this, and in fact, the anxiety is so crippling that it's stifling your life in a way, or crushing what you would normally do, or what people would normally do. So if you're socially anxious, there's a very common one. You might have this idea that sometime in the future you will be invited to a social gathering, or you will find yourself in a social gathering where people might want to talk to you and engage with you. They might discover that you're boring, or you might not know what to say, so you'd rather not have that because they'll judge you as being unworthy. And so to avoid the whole whatever, you'd rather not just socialize at all, you just stay at home. So there's a classic model of social anxiety, and you can see it captures all the elements there. The anticipation of the future, the temporal conceptualizing, if you like, the conceptualizing of some benchmark of how people should behave, wherever that came from, an anticipation of consequence, and also the value. It's important that people are socially competent. That's a real societal value there, and it's held at quite high esteem, that someone can be confident and know what to say, and if I can't be that person, then I'd rather not do it at all. So that's how anxiety rolls. Now, when I said earlier there's a reference point, and that's the somehow the mind has to decide on what is good and bad, we usually find that the mind makes it up itself. It makes up its own set of criteria from how to behave, and we find surprisingly little agreement between people on good and bad, at least in the more subtle forms. You might have cultural norms of good and bad, but again, that's a cultural norm, that's not an absolute. So you're not beholden to any cultural norm if you don't want to be, or anyone else's standard if you don't want to be. So the thing with reference points I find fascinating, because the mind has no way of benchmarking anything. It doesn't know any reference point except the ones that it creates itself. I find this is a great source of suffering for a lot of people. This idea that I've got to create some way of knowing if something's actually good or bad, and then I hold myself to it. And this is the other funny thing about the mind. Once it makes up its mind about a criteria, it doggedly holds on to it like a dog with a bone, you might say. So we have to somehow help the mind release its own criteria. That's a really hard thing to do, because the other thing that mind hates to do, and you'll love this one, the mind hates to be wrong. It just hates it. And in fact, there are a lot of cases where the person would actually rather die than be wrong. And there are many cases in history where people have actually died rather than be proven wrong. So there's a righteousness built into the structure of the mind, which makes the problems a bit more pernicious in some cases, a bit more embedded in that as a problem. So we have to work very carefully with the mind to retain that, to work around the sense of righteousness, to not pull out all the pins under all the frames of reference at once, so that'll upset the mind and it finds itself too disoriented. The other thing too is that shared beliefs that the mind might be holding could be shared ways of relating to your peer groups, so that, let's suppose, I used an example in another talk of racism, let's suppose that racism is the benchmark in your group and you find acceptance by your own racism, say, like, we don't like that skin color, so we all hang out together in our group and they all hang out together in their group, and that's how we delineate. And if we find ourselves mingling with each other, our anxiety goes up, not just because of the uncertainty about the situation, but because what others might think of me if they find out that I'm mingling with a person of a different skin color. So you can see that this benchmarking tendency might actually provide some benefit in some context, in terms of social inclusivity. You get a positive thing out of it. But at the end of the day, what this talk is about is the arbitrariness of it all. It's all smoke and mirrors, it's all hollow. The mind reports it, though, as real. It reports its anxieties as genuine. It reports the reference points as actual. These are actual reference points. No, people, these are shared agreements that you vaguely have an awareness of that may or may not be in the minds of others. So when we work with people with anxiety in the clinic, we explore and we gently pick it all apart. We pick it all apart, little bit by little bit, and that person finds relief often. And sometimes they need a license to let go of old beliefs. And what that means is, because of the mind's tendency towards righteousness and hating being wrong, you need to somehow very carefully get around the superego, as you might say in more Freudian terms, and give that mind a reason of why it was mistaken in the first place. And the best way to do that with people is to say, look, the mind is innocent. It doesn't really know what it's doing most of the time. It just takes on and adopts beliefs and positions from a very young age that, you didn't really examine too much at the time, and now you end up with them and they're not really helpful. So it's okay that you've ended up with a bunch of these unhelpful beliefs. Most people have them. I've got them. That they are there. Don't worry about it. Don't be afraid to examine them and perhaps let them go if they're no longer helpful to you. So the mind creates this wonderful collage of the world from its positions and beliefs about how things work, and often we find ourselves anxious about the world that we have created ourselves. And when I say we, let's just say the mind has created and not bring the person into that. So I hope this was a helpful brief dialogue to explain a little bit about anxiety and conceptualizations, because the conceptualizing process, once again, it's not a problem, totally natural, every mind does it. That's how the mind operates with concepts. It cannot operate outside of concepts. Yet, not every concept is going to serve your best interests. Not every concept is going to make you feel good. This has been X Winterview with a brief dialogue on anxiety. Comments welcome. Feedback supplied, hopefully in due course. Thank you.